This as the House and Senate get set to return from Thanksgiving break, facing a jam-packed agenda in the final 3 weeks of the 115th Congress. President Trump keeping the door open to a partial government shutdown early next month if Congress fails to give him the money he wants to fund a border wall.
We're talking about the border wall. We're talking about quite a big sum of money, about $5 billion. And I think probably if I was ever going to do a shutdown over border security, when you look at the caravans, when you look at the mess, when you look at the people coming in, this would be a very good time to do a shutdown.
Joining the panel this week, Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger, editorial page writer Kate Batchelder-Odell, and assistant editorial page editor James Freeman. So, Kate, how lame is this lame duck going to be, or is it going to get something done?
Yeah, Paul, I wish I could spread more holiday cheer this week, but I think I'm expecting disappointments on all fronts. Congress has a lot that needs to get done by the end of the year, as you mentioned, with the appropriations process, also a farm bill, some openings for things like prison reform, perhaps, if the majority leader is amenable, and then judges and nominations are also a big priority. So we'll see, but I don't think we should expect very much.
Well, what about this shutdown scenario? Because Trump seems to be serious about it, and if he's ever going to get some money for this, it probably would. The best chance would be now, before Democrats take the House, and about 2/3 or so of the government's already funded for the next year, so the shutdown would be less severe. Does that create an opening here that maybe we do get a showdown over the wall funding?
I think it's very possible we do get a showdown over the wall funding, but I'm not convinced of the wisdom of that strategy, Paul. I mean, the Senate has agreed to about $1.6 billion for the wall and physical barriers, and Trump wants closer to $5 billion. My question is, as always with shutdowns, what's the plan after the shutdown? So if they were to agree to a kind of short-term continuing resolution to move this to January, as you described, his hand gets so much weaker. So I think this is an opening to get as much as he can, but I don't think beyond that $1.6 billion, the policy trade-offs that Republicans are going to have to make to get more money, I don't think they're very good, if they're even possible.
Yeah, James, as I read it, the Democrats are saying, oh, you want your $5 billion? We'll give you your $5 billion. But here's our list: A, B, C, D. Protection for Mueller, for example. We want policy concessions on trade or other things. Is that worth the trade?
I don't know if you have to make that trade. I think, as you said at the top, the president is in a pretty strong position here. The military's already funded, so the Republican constituency that might be against a shutdown is not really relevant here. You basically have a lot of left-leaning people who work in the domestic agencies who want to get paid. Republicans historically have not done well in these battles. Right. This president is the exception. And it was over immigration that the Schumer shutdown happened. It lasted a weekend. Democrats didn't have the stomach for it. I think the president has some leverage here.
Yeah, but that's because Schumer wanted it and advertised the shutdown.
It's also because they got calls all weekend from their constituents who depend on government saying, keep those checks flowing.
All right, Dan, can you mediate this dispute?
It's not going to be easy. It is a lame duck session, and it ends at the end of December. There are only so many days left in the congressional calendar. And Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has a to-do list. Included on that to-do list are about 35 federal judges he would like to get confirmed and approved. He wants them through. You need votes on the House, on the Senate floor to do that. And they're also going to try to negotiate the wall. The wall is really the tail wagging the dog here. Donald Trump insists on that wall. All the other spending and all the other activity that's going to take place in December is going to be affected by that. And there's one other thing, one of the president's pet projects is criminal justice reform. That bill is out there, too. Mr. McConnell probably would rather do the judges than criminal justice reform. But if Donald Trump forces a government shutdown, a lot of this, including the judges, is going to push to the side.
But, Kate, on the judges issue, it looks as if McConnell doesn't necessarily want to get all those judges through. I mean, he has a couple that he wants to push, but not as many as 35 in this Congress. And when they hold the Senate in January, they figure they can do it. They can get some more. Is that a fair summary of the facts?
I think it's still shaping up, Paul. I think we could see more. There are cloture on 2 as it stands that will be voted on after Thanksgiving. Like Dan said, there are more than 30 that are ready for a floor vote at any time. And I think that should be the bare minimum that Congress does before heading home for Christmas, probably a little bit earlier than the rest of us will start celebrating the holidays. And there are also 20 more that are still awaiting a vote in the Judiciary Committee that Jeff Flake has been saying he's going to hold up because of the Mueller investigation, and he wants a vote on that protection bill, right? So there's a lot of opportunity to get more judges done, and I'm confident we'll see more than 2, and depending on how the Farm Bill, prison reform, et cetera, shapes up, hopefully we get at least 30.
All right, and Robert Mueller. Trump submitted the answers to the questions. I think it was a good call not appearing in person with Mueller. But Rudy Giuliani saying this is close to wrapping up. I don't have any confidence that that's true. I don't think we know that.
Yeah, it's a debate about how long you go without the long-sought collusion evidence. The government has now been at this for 2.5 years. Mr. Mueller specifically, 1.5 years. I think it's reasonable to say, out with it. If you have a collusion case, let's hear it. If not, let's move on.
And once again, the inevitable Flake footnote. Senator Jeff Flake, a lame duck on his way out, said he will hold up votes on those judges unless he gets a vote on the Mueller protection bill.
And he has leverage in the committee to do that. But I think basically this is it's an unconstitutional provision. You can't tell a president not to fire somebody who is an inferior officer.
When has that ever stopped anyone in politics these days?
And, Jeff Flake surely knows that. So this is not really the way I think he ought to go out.
All right, when we come back, trade tensions are high as President Trump...
They want to make it very badly. I have another $250 billion worth of tariffs to put on if we don't make a deal. And believe me, I'll be putting them on.
President Trump earlier this week warning that the U.S. would proceed with a threat to impose additional tariffs on $250 billion worth of Chinese products if Washington and Beijing don't reach a deal on trade, signaling that tough negotiations are ahead as the two sides prepare to meet at the G20 summit, which begins next week in Buenos Aires. President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping scheduled to sit down on the sidelines of that summit, their first face-to-face meeting in nearly a year. So what should we expect? Let's ask John Murphy. He's a senior vice president for international policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Welcome back, John. Good to see you. So the president says China wants to do a deal badly. How do you size up the incentive on both sides to do a deal?
Well, I think the administration has a good diagnosis about the industrial policies and trade practices that China has undertaken that are a problem. They deserve to be confronted, specifically the theft of intellectual property, the forced technology transfer policies. But so far, it's unclear just how this is going to play out. This is a meeting where there hasn't been that much staff work to prepare for it yet. It's difficult to say that a deal is ripe, and U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer has released an updated report about the details on these industrial policies that suggests that, in his view, it's not exactly time for a deal yet. So we may see this linger on for quite a lot longer.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me the president is correct in that the Chinese economy is feeling some pressure from the tariffs and a slowing growth. No question that there's some capital flight out of China. And yet, if you look at the United States, we seem to be slowing down, too. I mean, you can see in the business investment figures that there's some uncertainty that's affecting business investment in the United States from trade. Would you? How do you diagnose on either side the weight of incentives to do a deal?
Right. I think that's absolutely right. That across the United States, we're seeing the impact. In agriculture, China historically has been buying 30% of all U.S. production of soybeans, for instance, the top crop grown in the United States, and that's been just switched off this year. So that's been felt, and other crops as well. And for manufacturing as well, we're seeing a lot of the inputs that have come from China, raw materials and components that have gone into U.S. manufactured goods are more expensive. Companies don't like talking about it that much, that their costs are going up, but the pain is there underneath the surface. And you see it in construction as well, where a lot of the input costs, you see prices rising.
Well, the president needs a strong economy. I mean, if he goes into re-election year with 2% growth a la Obama or worse, I think he's going to lose. So, I mean, sooner or later, he's got to do a deal. Is this something that, for that reason, is this something that has to be done, a deal to remove the uncertainty on China trade in the early part of 2019 at the latest?
Well, certainly pressure is going to be mounting because those tariffs that we're slapping on China are actually taxes paid by Americans. And that's why we at the Chamber think they're the wrong approach. So we do think that this is going to linger on a bit longer, but the pressure is going to be there mounting, I think, day by day, especially if after January 1st we see a lot of those 10% tariffs ratchet up to the 25% level.
All right, let me turn to NAFTA here. The new NAFTA passed. The president signed it with Mexico and Canada. U.S.-Mexico agreement, Canadian agreement. Normally you would think that would be something to be voted on in the next Congress, but Pat Toomey, the Republican senator from Pennsylvania, has come out and said, with 11 other Republican senators, Mr. President, sign the deal before the end of the month, get a vote on it before the end of this Congress. Is that realistic?
Probably not. You know, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said that he just doesn't think there's time, and I think other trade leaders in Congress look at it that way. You would really have to have everything lined up, and as you know, Paul, there's many other items on the agenda here for the lame duck session.
Well, but I'll tell you what, it looks to me like the politics of this are not going well for the next Congress. You're already hearing Democrats saying, well, okay, this bill, this NAFTA deal, we'll look at it, but you're going to have to do several things before we'll even consider a vote. For example, you're going to have to tighten up the enforcement provisions. You're going to have to do more on labor protections and environmental protections. The environmental lobby is lined up totally against it, and the AFL-CIO is lukewarm on it. So I guess my question is this going to have a hard time passing a Democratic House?
There's certainly going to be a lot of wheeling and dealing and a lot of talk about how to enhance the enforcement provisions in the agreement. And we at the Chamber see a number of things you could do to prepare the way. One that we think is a priority is to lift the tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from Canada and Mexico. The administration had pledged that these would go away as soon as a new NAFTA deal was struck, and yet still they're there. We think that addressing issues like that could help build support across both sides of the aisle.
Well, but that would certainly increase support among some Republicans, but that's not going to get you Sherrod Brown's vote in Ohio, for example, is it? I mean, how many Democrats is that really going to turn?
So I think that in the incoming House of Representatives, there are quite a few new members coming in. We're Democrats who spoke out against tariffs. It was an interesting cycle in that sense. So it's too early to say, but there is interest in working on these trade issues on both sides of the aisle, I think.
All right, John Murphy, thanks for coming in. We're going to follow this closely as we go. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
When we come back, the Trump administration stands by Saudi Arabia, taking an America First stance in the wake of the Khashoggi killing. So is that the right response?
So it's a mean, nasty world out there.
In great shape. I'm not going to destroy the world economy, and I'm not going to destroy the economy for our country by being foolish with Saudi Arabia.
President Trump Tuesday defending the administration's support of Saudi Arabia and pledging to maintain its military and economic ties to the kingdom, despite news reports that U.S. intelligence has determined that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was directly involved in the murder of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, who was killed inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in early October. The U.S. sanctioned 17 Saudi officials in response to the killing, but many members of Congress, including Republicans, are calling on the administration to do more. We're back with Dan Henninger and James Freeman. So, Dan, what'd you make of the president's remarks on Saudi Arabia?
Well, I guess what we would call that, Paul, is realpolitik on steroids. Realpolitik being the idea that only practical concerns matter in foreign policy, only the interests of the United States matter, everything else is secondary or perhaps irrelevant. There was a lot of realpolitik practiced during the Cold War when we were fighting Soviet communism. One difference here. The Saudis clearly have virtually acknowledged that their intelligence forces murdered one of their own citizens in its consulate in Istanbul, Turkey.
They've acknowledged that.
They have acknowledged that.
The only question is whether MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, was somebody who gave the order, or did he, for example, say, well, yeah, you can take him, but, and then it just got out of hand.
Yeah, and the way this is developed, it would suggest that Mohammed bin Salman was the only person in Saudi leadership who did not know this was going to happen. So it's a violation of the U.S.'s ideals. And in his statement, the president really gave no bow whatsoever to the horror of what happened here. And this is a position that most public figures in the United States cannot defend. And I think our big concern over what the president has done is a lot of what he said about the Middle East was true. A lot of what he said about Iran and his threat is true. But by not acknowledging that there was a violation here of America's ideals, by not being more critical of Mohammed bin Salman, he makes it very difficult for his natural supporters in Washington, such as Senator Lindsey Graham or Senator Mitt Romney, to support his policy. It makes it more difficult to achieve his policy goals in the Middle East, which I do not think was his intention.
Well, the statement of national interest is real. Oil prices we care about. The Iranian showdown and our alliance against Iran we care about. It's important. Also, arms sales, fine, good, okay, we can sell that. But it's the reductionist description of that in Trump's rhetoric that says that's all it is. That I think most Americans say, really, we can't be more forthcoming in denouncing killing an opposition figure.
Yeah, we buy their oil, they buy our weapons. I think it's maybe not the most persuasive moral case for a lot of people. You saw in that Tuesday press conference where one of the reporters then asked about the moral case, and that's when he went to, I think, the more compelling argument that Iran's even worse, and this is essentially a counterweight to them. But it is the Crown Prince and his regime obviously not making it any easier, whether or not he actually ordered this killing. And it's kind of interesting watching the political left now embrace the CIA's conclusions. Now suddenly the CIA is to be trusted at all times. Kind of funny the way that's changed, and especially in relation to Middle East analysis over the last 2 decades. But I think what is a problem here is that the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia has sold himself as a modernizer who wants his country to enter the 21st century, to adopt Western-style tolerance, transparency, etc. And we're not seeing it. We're not seeing it here. We're not seeing it with the journal news reports of women being tortured, essentially political prisoners inside Saudi Arabia. We'd like to see the proof of modernization.
Yeah, and I covered Asia, South Korea, when it was run by a dictator, and they attempted to kill Kim Dae-jung, an opposition leader. I was covering the Philippines when under Marcos, when Ninoy Aquino was killed. That was in the Reagan years. And what they did was obviously they continued to deal with those allies, those authoritarian allies, but there was an element of idealism and in the relationship and in the statements. And they distanced themselves from Marcos, and they really squeezed Chun Doo-hwan, for example, not to hurt Kim Dae-jung. It was you don't behave this way is the message we sent. I would hope that U.S. would say that to Mohammed bin Salman. You do this again, and there are going to be real consequences.
Well, I think they have to do that, Paul, because the relationship with Saudi Arabia going forward is going to be difficult now, because MBS has shown some real errors in judgment here. Yes, he is attempting to do exactly what James described in modernizing Saudi Arabia. But this was a real bad call on his part, and he has made some others. So I think that Secretary of State Pompeo, National Security Advisor John Bolton now have got to talk straightforwardly with MSB and say, look, we have got to have a better understanding of our relationship. It cannot be based on what we've just seen.
All right, still ahead, the Trump economy. The president is touting robust growth and low unemployment, but do trade tensions and market turmoil signal challenges ahead? We'll ask a former Trump economic advisor next.
As a country, we're doing great. Our unemployment is at a record low. You look at all of the different statistics, I think your tech stocks have some problems.
By the way, had the other side won, it would have been a disaster. You would have been down 4.2% instead of up 4.2%. I think on the economy, you have to give me an A plus, maybe.
President Trump giving himself the modest grade of A+ on the economy in his recent interview with Fox's Chris Wallace, citing robust growth and low unemployment. But amid trade tensions with China, stock market turmoil, and signs of a global slowdown, are there challenges for the Trump economy ahead? Let's ask Steve Moore. He served as senior economic advisor to the 2016 Trump campaign and is co-author of the new book, Trumponomics. Steve, good to see you.
Bob.
So how would you define Trumponomics?
Well, Trump is not ideological like Reagan was. You know, Reagan was an ideological conservative.
In the sense of believing in free market principles.
Yeah, and also just having understanding the conservative movement and having read Bill Buckley and things like that. Trump is not ideological. He is just a common sense businessman. And, you know, one of the points we make in the book is that he just addresses he's sort of brought business principles to the White House. And fortunately, those are kind of common sense principles. Get taxes down, get government off the back of business, reduce regulations that we don't need. But he's also, he also is very pro-worker. I mean, that's the one thing I think people like say, oh, he just cares about rich people and so on. I mean, every conversation that Larry Kudlow and I and Art Laffer would have with them on the campaign, I say, okay, we'd suggest a policy. Well, how's that going to affect the steel worker in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, or the coal miner in Charleston, West Virginia, or the auto worker in Flint, Michigan? So he knows who brought him to this dance, and he's very hyper concerned about those workers.
I would argue that Reagan cared about those people as well, deeply about those people. So,
but, I mean, the obvious example of where he's not free market ideological is on trade.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, the two big places where I see difference with most conventional conservative economists would be trade and immigration.
Yep.
Because most conservative economists, I think you agree, think you need people to work. And we have a labor shortage now, and that's hurting in some areas. And then on trade, a tariff is a tax. And a tax, you tax something, you get less of it. And he doesn't have problems with either of those.
So I'll make a point to you that you may not like to hear, but I believe those were the two issues that probably won him the election. I mean, the fact is, and by the way, you know me, I'm very pro-immigration, I'm very pro-trade. But, that message doesn't sell very well in a lot of these Midwestern states. I mean, people really believe that it was the Chinese or the Mexicans that were responsible for, their factories leaving. And so Trump used those issues.
In the book, you follow the debate over taxes. But I know from my own reporting that in the summer of 2017, Donald Trump was saying, why not 44% at top marginal tax rate? Steve Bannon was pushing that inside. And it was only the Republicans in the House and Senate who said, Mr. President, no, you got to cut taxes across the board, ultimately prevail at him. And so my question is, if he is that transactional, and now he goes into a congressional session with Nancy Pelosi in the House, is there a danger that he says, oh, taxes, let's raise them?
Look, I don't think so, because, look, Trump isn't ideological, but he understands his conservative base. And I think he does understand, look, if I start raising taxes and do things that alienate my voters, I'm not going to win in 2020. So he may make some deals with Pelosi, but he's not going to give up these kind of core principles that help win him the election. I mean, the tax cut was a big election issue for Trump. I still think
I would argue that helped him win the election too.
You don't think that tax cuts helped him?
I did. It helped him enormously. Yeah. That's what I mean.
He understands that. And look, I think the polling is wrong. People in 2020, when the Democrats run on repealing the Trump tax cut, that's not a winning issue for them. I mean, people understand that they've got more money in their pocketbooks.
But would he be willing to do a deal? As he somebody asked him in the press conference recently, well, if you want that middle class tax cuts you talked about before the election, would you make an adjustment in raising rates on Steve Moore? So would he do that?
No, I don't believe believe he would. I believe that he understands that the people in the top 1% are small business owners. I mean, that was the other thing that Trump used to talk about all the time on the tax cut. We'd say, Donald, we call him Donald, you got to cut the corporate rate. You've written 100 editorials on that, right? About the gap between our rate and their rate. And he'd always say, yeah, I get that. But he'd say, what are we going to do for the small businesses, the 27 million small businesses? That's why we cut the highest income tax rate and the income tax rates on the individual side, because that's the tax that the small businesses are paying.
All right, let's talk about the economy now, because there are some real signs of a slowdown.
There is.
And business investment is a little shaky right now. What's going on?
Well, look, I'm still pretty bullish on the economy. I think we're going to get maybe 2.5% growth for the fourth quarter. Housing is
That's
a little
down from.
I know it is. But still for the year we're going to come in at 3 to 3.5% growth. And I don't believe these forecasts by the Goldman Sachs people who've predicted 8 of the last 2 recessions. That say recession's around the corner. The left looks at the situation today. They can't quite understand how it is Trump's policies have created this prosperity. And so they've fallen back on this position. This is just a Keynesian sugar high. Right. And the problem with it, number one, it isn't a Keynesian sugar high. Number two, the tax cut it's not like it expires next year. We've got at least 5 more years of this. So my view is this tax cut is just starting to kick in.
But here you got the trade problems, you've got the slow growth abroad, and the trade uncertainty is affecting investment.
Absolutely. No question about that. But I'm going to give you the positive twist on this. If Trump prevails on China, and I am a hardliner on China as Trump is. I think China is a bad actor. I think he's got to win here. I think he is going to win. I don't know if it's going to take 3 months or 6 months or 9 months. But if